We have an interesting night. We have a few presentations tonight. I'm going to kick it off with talking about Knockout.js specifically and how it works with HTML applications. So if you're building an HTML app or an ASP.NET app or an MVC app, these technologies become more important and the landscape gets muddier and muddier. It's more confusing now than it has ever been because there's so much to know and so much to learn, and there's so many options available and all this other stuff. So we will look at one specific technology today which has sort of grabbed hold. Microsoft supports it. It was written by a Microsoft employee, so it has traction. It ships with Visual Studio 2013, I believe. So it's not something that's going to kind of go away. A little bit about myself. I'm based in New Jersey, so happy to be here in Sydney. I was at TechEd last week. I'm the Senior VP of Dev Tools at Infragistics. Like I mentioned, I've been an MVP for 10 years. My MVP renewal is up in October 1st. So in about 2 weeks, I start getting that renewal anxiety, like, am I going to be an MVP again? I never expect it. It's always a nice gift. So it's cool to be an MVP and just kind of shows all the stuff we do. And David Barella also, who will be speaking later, he's an MVP as well. His first year. He's an Azure MVP, so that's pretty cool. I've written a bunch of books. First one was on VB.NET back in 2002. Was working on it in 2001. Did C# Bible. I did 3 Silverlight books. Yeah, it was a short shelf life for those. They're still very relevant, I guess, in some parts of the world, you know. But yeah, not the best move on my part. A lot of effort, and it's kind of like, yeah, no one really buys those books anymore. And obviously very happy back in Australia. It's my third time in Australia. I was at TechEd last week. Actually, David was there as well. He had 3 talks last week. Was told about one talk 3 hours before he did it.
30 minutes.
30 minutes. So Andrew was sick. David, you're doing the talk. Awesome. But anyway, love it here. It's great weather. I guess this is winter right now. It's beautiful, or just ended. It's really nice. So it's different than winter in New Jersey. So anyway, here's what we're going to talk about. MVVM, using MVVM in JavaScript. Talk about single-page applications. And essentially what I'm going to show you is how to use Knockout.js, how a web page actually can work in a single-page application, and then doing something a little richer using something like Web API to get your data. So Web API is fairly new technology from Microsoft to most people. It's probably a couple years old. It's had a couple iterations. But moving forward, that's a lot of the recommendations, like using Web APIs, the way you should get server data. It's extremely simplified the way that you can actually get server data and get it down to any client. So you'll get a little exposure to that today. So an intro to MVVM. And one of the things I want to point out is, and just highlight as I go through these slides, is that if you're a web developer today, how many people are web developers? So most of the folks in the room have done web development. It depends. If you've been in the Microsoft world doing ASP.NET, it's always been pretty straightforward. Like I open up an ASP.NET project template, and I just start dragging and dropping controls. I build user controls. I have code behind. I can use patterns and all these other things in my architecture, but the platform basically had everything I needed to be successful. Now it gets more complicated because people want to have clients that are running HTML5. They want to have responsive web design. They want to work in a mobile phone and a Samsung 10-inch tablet and the desktop in the same way. And out of the box, ASP.NET may not provide everything you need to actually deliver that. So that's where you start seeing all these other frameworks come to light. So frameworks like AngularJS, Backbone.js, Knockout.js, almost anything with JS at the end is a new framework. I think there's a website, Scott Hanselman mentioned, newframeworkaday.com or something like that, where literally every day there's a new framework that gets pushed out, and it's normally has JS at the back or something cool, you know, .io or .something, you know, because like URLs, we're running out of good names for patterns. But when you look at the slide that Microsoft talks about now, this one ASP.NET, there's MVC, there's ASP.NET as a platform and also as a project template. And then there's all these other third-party frameworks that you've probably never used. but they all kind of work together because essentially you have a client piece, which is HTML and JavaScript, and then you may or may not have a server piece. 9 times out of 10 you have some sort of a server piece, but you're not required to actually have it all tidy up nicely in an ASP.NET project. So your world gets a little more complex, and that's why something like Knockout.js, we start talking about MVVM for web developers, becomes important because data binding as it was in ASP.NET is not the same anymore. It's not as simple as it used to be. Or you may say it's actually better and simpler. It's really just kind of what angle you're coming at it from. So the MVVM pattern, if you're coming from XAML, is going to be very familiar to you. It's a software design pattern that emerged around 2005, and it really was specifically around helping developers who were building WPF applications, Silverlight applications, and I don't think it was Silverlight at the time, but build them so the data binding could help me create decoupled, testable applications. So I want to have a real good separation of concerns. I want to be able to say that I have a view, and my view is different from the model, and it's different from, well, we'll talk about the view model, and all these things are separated out so I can actually test them independently, or at least test my view very easily, or test my view model very easily, etc. So at the end of the day, this pattern gets wide adoption. There's all kinds of frameworks for WPF that are built around MVVM. We get to the HTML JavaScript world. How do we do it? Well, they've modeled stuff after MVVM to work in JavaScript now. So really, I have a kind of a cool slide that shows this that was in one of the Microsoft presentations that'll help sort of clarify how the various pieces work together. But there's essentially 3 pieces to MVVM. You have models, view models, and views. So the model essentially encapsulates your domain model. This is something that you've been using for years, no matter what you've been building out. You're like, okay, here's sort of some data representation that maps to either a single or multiple tables or a view or something on a back end. So the model actually defines your domain model. So when we talk about your domain model, you stick it in the model. Not new, and this covers, you were probably doing this back in VB6 or well before .NET. So it has nothing necessarily to do with .NET. It's just that the words change over time. And when you look at a picture like this, it kind of makes sense. This is a class model in Visual Studio. But anyway, things like first name, company name, you could have business logic, etc. So the model's fairly simple to understand and pretty straightforward. The view model, or actually the view, is the UI. We've all been building UIs forever. Hopefully you've been using Infragistics controls. This is not a commercial talk here. But anyway, you have user interface, user clicks something, what happens? When you're doing ASP.NET, user clicks something on your ASPX page, 9 times out of 10, you probably had some code behind. You had something in C#. As your code evolved and you want to do richer stuff on the client, you've triggered JavaScript functions, and those JavaScript functions did something on the client. So when you're dealing with this view in HTML JavaScript, everything's happening on the client. There is no code behind. There's no server piece per se. You may have your JavaScript file separated somewhat, but at the end of the day, everything's happening on that client side. So there's a difference in how you're actually building out this view when you're building a pure HTML JavaScript application. All right, so then finally we have the view model. So this really is responsible for holding the state, presentation logic, exposing application data. So you have things like properties that actually hold the state. So what you'll see in view models traditionally is a property that contains the customer's object, or a property that contains something that was just clicked, or something that's going to happen between that view and the model. So the view model ends up being something relatively important in this pattern because it's really the glue that holds things together. So in this case, you can see I've got a couple things here. Get customers, save customers. There's property change events that fire. And this is really modeled after doing MVVM and WPF. All right, so why is this important? The reason this is important, and I sort of alluded to this earlier when you're building a WPF application and now moving off to, or moving forward into the JavaScript world, there's 3 things that are easy to pick off. The first one is developer-designer collaboration without conflict. So when you think about how we built applications in Windows Forms or even ASP.NET, you had a designer and they would design pages for you, and then they would kind of throw it over the wall. Say, all right, this is what we want it to look like, and there should be, they had little arrows and say, here's some interaction that should happen. You're like, okay, I got to actually recreate this as a developer, right? I have to figure out how this design is going to map to my actual application. It was very difficult. Everything was kind of strewn together. The beauty and the promise of XAML was that there was that separation. So if I can actually have a designer building out a user interface and that UI is separate but completely 100% reusable or used in the project, I don't have to worry about code that's not going to get used. So that collaboration actually worked and made sense. And most of you guys that did, how many people did WPF with designers in the day? Yeah, so it worked, right? You're like, yeah, this is great. I don't have to like worry about redesigning something because it was all just XAML. Same with HTML today. Testable code really about, from a developer perspective, looking at decoupling the view from the view model really helps testability. It helps that separation of concerns. It helps it make so I can write something here, test it, write something there, test it, and not have things munged together. And that's why we couldn't test Windows Forms very well, and that's why TDD and all that wasn't very popular when it comes to Windows Forms, ASP.NET, etc. It got popular later on. And then code maintainability. Anytime you can have decoupled code that's testable, you're going to have better maintainability. So when you look now at some of the maintenance projects that you guys have to do, and you open up the solution in Visual Studio and you're like, where do I start? That's not very maintainable code. But if you can have something well refactored, well structured, decoupled, you can actually debug it easier and maintain it and fix bugs faster. And that's the key to this. So you can pick which benefit might be most important to your organization or your team, but these are three that are really easy to sort of highlight as benefits of looking at the MVVM pattern specifically. And of course, there's all kinds of architectural patterns that you probably use every day that give different types of benefits. But for MVVM specifically, these are three that make sense and are pretty simple. All right, so MVVM and JavaScript. And when I did these demos, I did this talk in TechEd India. I was in India in March, and we did the same talk in Bangalore, Delhi, and Pune. And I actually spent a little bit of time going through WPF in one of the talks or two of the talks, and I realized, well, you know what? It's not really that important for you to see how this works in WPF because you don't really care. You're here to talk about HTML and JavaScript. So between these two slides, there used to be a demo, but I don't want to do that demo because I don't think it's that important for the context of moving forward with something like MVVM and JavaScript. And so if you want to talk about WPF later, we can. Actually, David is a resident expert on using this pattern across multiple platforms. He's done phone apps, store apps, WPF. So even in the breaks, you can talk to David or myself. But anyway, let's talk about MVVM and JavaScript. So this is where Knockout.js comes into play. So this, again, is where it gets interesting with Visual Studio 2012. I think it was 2012, and maybe it was 2010 that started to include jQuery in the box, right? Where all of a sudden there's this open source software that Microsoft is shipping and supporting. And now, moving forward in Visual Studio 2013, Knockout.js is in there as well. So Microsoft says, hey, we're going to support this thing. If you have a problem with it, we'll make sure it gets fixed. So I don't necessarily know the details of how that works, but it's just a different world than what we're used to living in. Something like Git is not open source, but it's free, right? And it's like the rebel against TFS, but guess what? Well, you guys both look at each other like, what? It is open source, all right. So you can actually Git with Git, right? But it works seamlessly with TFS now. So at TechEd, they're giving out all these stickers about using GitHub with TFS. And it's just a different way that Microsoft looks at the world now. So you don't have to be afraid that if I use Git, I'm going to be left behind. If I use something like Knockout.js, I'm going to be left behind. If I use something like jQuery, so many libraries now that are built on jQuery, it's crazy. So anyway, Microsoft ships this. It's supported by them. You don't have to worry about it. But Knockout is very specifically an open source library. Properties in the model class that we mentioned earlier are of a type called KObservable. So what happens is you have this framework called Knockout. I have all these properties and bindings sitting around an HTML page. How does the page actually know that this stuff is going to be data bound? Or how should it keep track of changes on these things that are on my page, all these properties? Well, what happens is you create an instance of something of type KObservable. So once it's of that type, then it will track, the page will track changes. And that's sort of the magic on how this works. When you do this in WPF, the framework has it built in. So the framework has data binding built in. I don't have to worry about tracking things myself necessarily. Something like Knockout.js, I'm creating a specific type, and that type then will be tracked. So you can have properties on your page that are automatically tracked and properties on your page that you're just kind of dealing with as strings on a page and they're not necessarily tracked. So the knockout observable type becomes pretty important. And then these observables notify the subscribers of property changes. So this all happens in the knockout framework. It'll become a little clearer as I do a demo on observables, where they come from, how they work, etc. So if I look at this XAML versus HTML, the biggest difference is the words are a little bit different. So of course in C# XAML I've got a window. My presentation layer is written in XAML. That's actually what's represented on the screen. Business logic's written in C# or VB or whatever the heck language you happen to be using. And then the common language runtime actually does the binding for me. So it handles all this stuff for me. In JavaScript, the browser actually becomes that runtime, essentially. The browser is the application and the runtime that hosts my page, and it manages all these libraries within the page. So over the years, we've all had issues with browsers and different sort of types of support with browsers and how browsers behave for different feature sets. Well, the goal of these third-party libraries like Knockout, like jQuery, is that they abstract what you care about for the specific function that they're offering away from what the browser runtime necessarily does or doesn't do, and gives you a safe way of achieving it. So Knockout, for example, gives me a safe way of doing data binding across different browsers, across different browser versions, as long as I use the library that I want to use, the supported version. So I don't know what version Knockout's on today, but it's no different than jQuery. jQuery is going to abstract away how you interact with stuff in the browser, and they're going to guarantee you a certain level of support on certain browsers. The risky thing is something like jQuery, when they're moving to jQuery 2.0, they're going to drop older browser support. So if you actually go ahead and you start using some of these newer libraries, you have to make sure it's not just an upgrade that gives you a couple new features. It potentially could break an application that worked before because the browser support isn't there for something very specific to what you might need. So they're basically the same, and if I click this guy, you'll see here my binding actually is going to be handled here by Knockout. So how do I get this going in my page? So the first thing that I do, you're used to referencing script tags in a page. In this case, I reference Knockout in my view. So I have the page that the browser is actually going to browse to. So I have an example, customers.html. So in customers.html, how do I ensure that the data binding that I want to occur in that page actually happens? The first thing is you have to reference a library. It's no different than referencing something like jQuery or any third-party library that you use. So that's step one. Step two is you associate the view with the view model. So when you're using jQuery or any web page, you're actually going to create an instance of something. So in my page, I'm going to create an instance of my customer view model. When I do this, I'm actually applying the bindings, all the types of KO observable, so Knockout actually knows about them. So once I instantiate this on the page, Knockout is aware of what's going on the page because of the type that's being tracked, and everything that happens from that point on is tracked. So I don't have to worry about bindings. I don't have to worry about doing anything manual. This magic just sort of occurs. So it makes it very easy for you to create a view model, apply that view model to your view, and then all of a sudden the data bindings happen, and it's really, it's pretty amazing. You'll see in one of the demos, it's like, oh, how'd that happen? Well, Knockout actually tracks that for you. So it's parsing the DOM, it's watching what your interaction with the page are, keystrokes, etc., properties that are changing, and they're updating on other places on the DOM. So back when you started doing WPF, and in 2008, you were doing your first MVVM application, and you changed a property of something in your view model, and then in your view you had it in 8 spots and just magically updated. Well, that property notification event happened, and then the CLR went ahead, processed it, and changed everything that was attached to that property on the page. So then you didn't have to worry about manually changing anything yourself. That's the magic that essentially is happening here. So how do you actually tell your HTML elements that they're bound to something? There's a data bind syntax that you use that basically says, okay, I want to bind an attribute. I want to bind a property of an element to something in my data source. So in this case, I have a for each. This for each is bound to a customers array. This customers array is of a knockout observable array, so it's being tracked by knockout. And then whatever I happen to have in my for each statement is going to magically bind to any properties that match that key value pair in the array. So in this case, I have a picture URL and I have a text full name. So I'm data binding the attribute source. So in your image, what does an image have? It has a source attribute. I'm data binding the source attribute to picture URL, which is a property in customers, and I'm binding the text property of this hyperlink to the full name property. So how would you do this without knockout? You would have some way of iterating through this loop in JavaScript, and it would probably be a bunch more lines of code, and it would be a little harder to do and be less maintainable, and you'd have a bunch of goo stuck inside of your view that you have to worry about later, and it really wouldn't be that testable. So this is sort of the magic of how knockout works. It's pretty straightforward. So bindings are declared, just kind of review this again. Bindings are declared in the visual element marked up by using the data bind attribute. Bindings are associated with the view model properties that are observable. So remember, this type of KO observable is when you define a property as KO observable, that means when you apply those bindings in the loader of your page, Knockout will then watch those. Now they're being observed by Knockout, so anything that changes, Knockout will make sure to rebind to other properties automatically for you. So we'll just kind of go through this in the demo.
There's only two-way binding. There's no single binding or anything like that. It's always two-way binding.
So what do you, one-way versus two-way binding?
Yeah, there's only supports all kinds of.
Yeah.
So you only get two-way.
Just for the guys that are new to come, if we can have the questions on the microphone for the people at home.
So the
Do you want to do that one again?
Yeah, so the question was around one-way or two-way binding, and correct, you get two-way binding with Knockout. So I can change something on the page, and it'll update the observable, and vice versa.
It actually does have one-way binding. You just don't use the KO observable. You just have a property. Okay.
Thank you. So if you don't make it of type KO observable, it's one-way binding, which would be just like just setting a property, essentially. So some of the bindings that you get for each, which you saw on the screen, previous screen, visible is an example, value is an example, click, so you can actually bind to a click event. And there's more. The nice thing about Knockout is if you go to knockoutjs.com, I put down maybe some of the more commonly used bindings. It's a fairly simple framework. The bindings are listed on the left-hand side. You click them and it gives you like a little page. It describes it. It's not very deep. So you can learn it relatively quickly, and there's good examples, and they sort of run within the page. So it makes it pretty easy to learn Knockout. All right, so let's go to look at how this actually works. So let me minimize this slides. And I'm going to show a couple examples. The first thing I'm going to show is just a simple sample of using Knockout in a single page. These are all going to be single page applications that I show. Everything's encapsulated into a single page. There's really nothing else going on. I've got a couple JavaScript references that will show a little bit of the structure in another example. Then we'll go into our example using Web API. But anyway, here we have a basic web page. And what I'm doing in this web page is just showing some simple bindings between properties on a page or HTML elements on a page and something in your observable. So you'll notice the first thing at the top here, I'm referencing Knockout. So in this case, it's Knockout 2.2.0. I don't even know what the most recent version of Java or of Knockout is. David, do you know what the most recent version of Knockout is? I'm not even sure. But this was valid and referenceable back in March. So there may be an updated version, but it really doesn't matter for this example because we're just using it in this page. If there's new features, and actually no, there was a new version of Knockout coming out probably about 2 months ago that had some new features, and I don't know exactly what they were, but if you're looking at Knockout, they did have a beta version or something new that was coming out. But anyway, you'll notice what I'm doing here on the page is I'm creating types of KO observable. So I've got first name, last name. So these are just properties on the page and they're type of KO observable. I also have something of a type observable array, and I'm sticking things in an observable array. So actually when you have a basic type of KO observable, it's just a property on the page. You can have an array that's actually being managed by Knockout on the page. The array you can add items to, remove items from. These functions are just very simple functions that are removing and adding items based on interactions on the page. So what happens is after I create all of these observables, I want to apply those bindings. So I'm going to apply the bindings to this page. So in the screen that we saw earlier in the deck, we saw that we applied those bindings by using attributes on HTML elements on a page. So if I scroll down on my page here, what you'll notice is just a few properties or a few HTML elements, and they're actually using the same data bind syntax that I had in the deck. And in fact, some of this might have been pasted right from the deck. But for the first name, for the input type equals text, if this was just a regular input on a page and I displayed it and I would type into it and I didn't use Knockout, I would have to manage what I would do with that data on a submit or on some event that occurred on the page. So I would be responsible for tracking the changes of that, for binding that to other elements on the page, whatever. With Knockout, just using the data bind syntax, it's actually going to manage it for me. So I don't have to worry about this particular text box per se. I just have to worry about the property of type KO observable on my page that I'm going to look at. So then that property will actually have the value, the most current value that I care about, that I can do whatever I want with when my page gets submitted, when whatever I'm doing in my for my business case. But here we have something cool about Knockout as well, which kind of makes it even more magical when you do a demo. Is I have this input type equals text data bind first name, so first name is our property name, but I have value update after key down. So what's actually going to happen is as I'm typing, anything else that's bound to this property will actually change as well. So I'm typing and you'll see a name change and you'll see it change in 5 places. I'm not actually writing any code to make that happen. It's happening automatically because Knockout is watching this, it's observing this property on the page, and anything that is using the data bind attribute to that property is going to change with it. So that's how it works. It's parsing, it parses the DOM, it sits there and it watches, when does this property change? Well, if it's bound to other things with the data bind attribute, I'm going to go ahead and make sure that changes as well. So I have your first name as a span data bind first name. Next down here, I've got another input type equals text. I'm going to bind this to the last name, and I've commented out here the value update. So I really don't want anything to happen as I'm typing the last name property and a few other data bind attributes. That's very simple, straightforward. This is where it gets a little interesting. You notice here we have a hyperlink, we have a for each. So on my data bind show hide friends, text equals friends.length. So I'm actually binding to the length of the array. So how does it know that? Well, Knockout knows because Knockout's managing this array. It's a type observable array. So whatever properties I can get off of that array, I can use on my page. So in this case, I'm going to say click on the number, which it'll be 3 because I added 3 items to my array. And then what's going to happen? I have a visibility property I'm binding to. What is my visibility? It's show friends. So show friends is going to say, is this shown or hidden? And it's going to do, I'm going to hide it or show it. So that's how I'm binding to an actual event happening on the page. So literally any attribute that you want to bind to, you can with Knockout. You're not limited just to a text property per se. And then in the for each, identical to what we saw in our slide, the friends array, for each one of the guys in my friends array, I want to have a list item of the name and then a hyperlink to actually remove it. So here, click parent remove friend. What's that's going to do? It's going to remove that item from my observable array. And that's the last thing here is adding a new friend. So I'm also going to have a button to add a new friend. So I type it into a box. I'm just going to push that into the array. And how am I doing that? If I scroll back up, click add friend right here. Let's scroll back up. How do we know? We're going to click and add friend. Here I've got add friend. So it's bound to this add friend function. And what's that going to do? It's going to add that new friend to my observable array. So it'll just track it and manage it for me in the page. So if I run this guy, it's a little anticlimactic, but this is kind of how it works. So it's the wrong group here. Let's change this to Steve Ballmer. So you'll notice as I typed, there's other things on the page that are changing. So I had bound this on after the value gets updated, I'm going to, Knockout's actually watching it, so every time I type, everything else on the page is updating as well. Otherwise, if it didn't do that, it'll do what last name is doing, and it's not going to change the value as the update, after update occurs. It'll do it once the focus of that control is gone. So your name, Ballmer, your full name, Steve Ballmer. And now when I click has the 3 friends, this was the hyperlink. You can see that here's Bill, and I've got the remove. So if we go back, scroll down, it had a for each. So here is my for each friends. If we go back up, what the heck was friends? Friends was this type here of KO observable, and I just added items to friends. It's KO observable array. So this array, it's a special type of array that Knockout is observing, so it's going to manage what's in that array after this page renders. So as I scroll down, or actually I go back to my page, I can remove Bill, I can add new, and you'll notice what's happening here is my page, no matter what I do, never changes. Everything happens on the page through the JavaScript library, through Knockout, with no page refresh, anything, which is a great secondary benefit to client-side scripting, is that you don't have to change values in a data source based on a post back to the server. I'm not waiting for that to happen. Everything's happening here within my page, single page application. So the whole point of a single page app is everything loads once, my libraries load, my data loads, and then I'm off to the races. Everything else that occurs on that page is happening on the client. Now, it's not to say I can't go off to the server and add stuff to my page. So in a real app, if I did a remove or an add, I may call a web service, go off to the network, do something, and come back maybe with a notification or an ID or something. But the point is my page actually never refreshes. So this is a simple example of Knockout with a couple features of Knockout, but it's the most common features. And if you think about how you want to build pages, 9 times out of 10, half your battle ends up being around, whoops, my battery's dying. Half your battle ends up being around managing all the context of the data on your page. And that's where Knockout really shines and helps you out. So let's look at something a little bit richer, but not any more difficult by any means. Richer, just a different UI. So I've got a sample here which is shows a couple things. And let's see. It's Hello World. Hello World Part 1. Now this one's okay. So maybe not. All right, so let's open up this guy here. And what I want to show here is how, based on what we looked at earlier, you can have a little bit different separation of concerns. So this example, I'll just run it real quick so you can see what it looks like. So I'll launch it in Chrome. And again, this is a single page application. the point of the single page application is that all my stuff loads at once. So at this point, I've loaded up my knockout libraries, I've loaded up all my JavaScript files, and from this point forward, all of the interaction on the page is going to be handled through data binding using knockout, and I'm not going to go back to the server. I could go back to the server, but I'm never really going to refresh the page, and I'm going to have different screens pop up, etc. So in this case, I'm going to click View Customers. So I have a list of customers here. I want to click on one of the customers, and I get more details on that particular customer. And you can see that it's not like I can scroll up and down. There's nothing else on this page. If I go back to my list. If I go home, I'm back to here. If I click this guy, I'm on a different view, a data grid view, and I'm back here to view customers. So there's a lot of stuff happening here on this page, but it's basically the exact same code we just looked at. All I'm doing is showing and hiding things based on what the interaction is in the UI. But what's different about this particular page is how I have my project structured. So in this case, I'm still using Knockout debug library. I've got my customers model in a separate JavaScript file. I've got my data in a separate JavaScript file, and I've got my customer view model in a separate JavaScript file. So if I go to Objects View Model folder here, let's go up once, go to Scripts, Objects. You'll see here I've got Model and View Model. So if we look at our model and look at customer.js, this is almost exactly like what you saw in the first example. It's just extracted into a separate JavaScript file that I'm referencing as my model. So here I have a customer object with a few properties, ID, first name, last name, etc. And then I'm making sure that all of these properties are of type KO observable. So when I create an instance of this object, these properties are going to be watched by Knockout on my page as you're interacting with it. So as you change the company name, those bindings are getting updated on the page. Knockout's managing all that for me. This is cool here. You can see full name. Super easy way to combine elements through Knockout. Just using a...
I've got a question from the online audience.
Oh, sure.
Okay. The question is, does ASP.NET bundling and minification have any negative impact on Knockout.js?
Bundling and minification? No. No negative impact. So, in fact, and I'll bring this up really quick because I was kind of going to show it in a second anyway, but this slide here, you start looking at some of what Microsoft is talking about with Knockout and the current ASP.NET, the one ASP.NET sort of direction. So here we've got Knockout.js being used on the client to manage binding. I'm using an MVC project with Web API and Entity Framework. So you don't have a negative effect using any of the current ASP.NET or MVC project templates from Microsoft or the bundling. And in fact, at MVP Summit, it was Build, Scott Hanselman did a demo using, I believe it was Knockout, but he was also showing the bundling too. So it actually all kind of works quite nicely together. So thanks for that question. So let me jump back to this guy here, and I'll go back to my objects. Well, here's datastore.js, just so you know where this data is coming from. Oh, let's escape out of this guy. So where the data is coming from is going back to this folder structure, datastore.js. And in datastore.js, all I'm doing is populating my customer array. So exactly like the simpler array that we did earlier in the previous example, but this is called get customers. And now if I go back and go up one to my view model, you'll see here we have the customer view model. So now what's happening in the customer view model is I'm creating my different KO observable types. I'm going to populate those types within my view model with that data store that we just saw. So I want to have this customer array, and I want to populate that customer with data. And then here we have some other things happening. We have our loader, so load customers is right here. This is the data service to actually get the customers and populate this from my data store. So I'm going and iterating through that array, loading it up into my observable array of type KObservable. And now once that is bound, once I apply those bindings to my HTML page, that's all being managed by Knockout. So every interaction that happens with that array, it's being tracked. I don't have to worry about any of it. And then there's a few other things here, like different functions, like reset function. I'm setting the current context of my page to home. So I'm basically showing and hiding different things, displaying different things, and that's all done through data binding. Normally what you would do, or in the past what you would do is either A, show and hide a div through some JavaScript on the page. You may do a post back to show a new page. You may use a tab control. You may do something different, but all of this ends up happening through binding with Knockout. Here we're doing self-current customer. So earlier when I clicked on that customer hyperlink, I was actually populating the current customer object with whatever the current items were on the page. So full name, picture, URL, etc. And then finally, we'll go to the page. But in the single page app, what happens is all this stuff happens and then we load it. So then it loads itself. So I'm setting up all this stuff and then I say load customer. So this basically self-executes the function. So if I go back to my customers page, we'll just kind of take a look real quick at that. Customers, views, customers at HTML. Edit this guy. So what happens here is I create an instance of my customer view model, and then I apply those bindings to customer view model. So I create an instance, it loads it up, and then I apply those bindings to my page. So ko.apply bindings in my view is what fires up all of the magic that's going to happen on the page. And then if we look at what's happening in this page, it's really no different than what we saw in our previous example. We have different things, different attributes, different events bound to HTML elements on the page. So I've got a button, which is data bound to the view all function. It's going to show all of the customers. I've got visibility functions that are bound, setting the current context to all or to a particular item. We saw the reset function, which will display nothing on the page actually. It'll just hide everything on the page. We have a for each, which is actually how we're loading up all of the images and items from the array into that nice list. So here I have a for each customers, and I'm iterating through that, and I've got my image source attribute. I'm data binding to the full name, and on the click, I'm going to the, I'm actually setting the current customer that's in the array. So I change the view, and it displays, etc. So a little richer example, but essentially the same sort of thing. I'm creating observables on a page, I'm binding those to HTML elements on a page, and then through the interactions, you can sort of see that this nice single page application gives a really good user experience. I don't have to go back to the server for anything. And then at certain points, it's sort of up to me to determine, do I go back to the server for anything? When do I update my data? How do I actually get my data from the server? Because in this example, it was just from a JavaScript file. So we want to show something that's a little more realistic. So here in Visual Studio, I actually have a very simple web API set up, and it's not much more complicated than what you saw in JavaScript. So the first thing I have, or that I'll show, is my customer model. So I've got my properties for my ID, first name, last name, etc. And then I've got my customer controller. So what's going to happen in my customer controller? Well, in this case, if it was a real app, I would actually be doing some call to some data source, getting it from a database, and then populating that database or data from the database into an array or into objects or whatever it would happen to be. All I did was literally copy and paste the same JavaScript into here, made a couple changes, and I'm ready to go. But it's using something that's going to live on a server, so you can see how this interaction actually takes place. Now I've got a couple functions. I've got get all customers and get customer by ID. I've set a couple breakpoints here so you can actually see how this works. It's actually pretty slick. So first off, let me just make sure I have the correct client open. And that's where I noticed I did not have my server piece here. So let me see. part 1, SPA sample code. Part 2. All right, let me unzip this guy real quick. I think that's the one I need to unzip. So I'm unzipping this because I want to show you the HTML client for some reason, or maybe I have it in Dropbox. Let me check real quick. Let me go to presentations, Tech Ed India. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know where the heck I stuck it. But anyway, let's go back here. Whew, lot of folders. So here's part 2. So the only difference between part 2 and what we saw earlier was in part 1, it was purely JavaScript, right? Everything was happening on the client and in any server piece, whatever. So in this example, there's really no difference in anything in my view, or there's absolutely no difference in anything in my view. The only difference is where I'm actually populating this data. So before I had that datastore.js, well, I'm not going to use datastore.js. I'm actually going to go ahead and populate it with the web API now. So if I go to the server side, let me close this one out and open up this guy just to make sure it's the right one. So same thing. Here we've got our controller, customer controller, and we'll set our breakpoints like so. So there I've got everything happening. And then here in the client piece, so let's go to the client, go to customers, let's go to scripts, objects, let's go to my view model, and let's edit my view model. So previously in my view model, what I did was I was using the data from datastore.js, which was my array of customers and customer details. Here I'm going off to my web API customers, and I'm actually getting the data from there and then populating my observable array with that data. So if you want to have a server piece and you want a really easy, fast solution, a web API is the way to do it. It's very simple, very straightforward. Of course, you don't have to use web API, but Microsoft recommends you use web API, I'm pretty sure. At least that's what I've heard. So let's go ahead and run this guy. No. Let's go ahead and run this guy. Let's not go ahead and run this guy. Ah, path is too long. Okay. So let's go take this, this.
Too much folder inception going on.
Server, copy. This may already be in this location. No, it's not. Okay, good. Paste. Okay. Web API. Man, I wonder where I had that other one open from. Come on now. So let's go ahead and run this guy. Come on. All right, so if you've done an MVC application, it's very similar. You have your controllers. The only difference is where the .NET framework is actually looking to build this application. In this case, it wants to not create an MVC project, it's creating a web and API project. So you get a nice little simple display here, but what I can do is just type in something like API customers, and what's going to happen is I get my breakpoint. So at that point, my array is already populated, and I'm just going to return this whole array of customers. So when am I going to use that? I'm going to use that in my default list view. So my default list view is going to get populated like so. So we'll continue there. And here I can say, let's do customers, and we'll get ID, whoops, API. You got to do it right. And now I've said, give me ID number 5, and I'm just kind of showing like, yeah, breakpoints work. This is no different than any other web service that you're calling. What makes this really great is that you can step into it, you can set breakpoints, you can do all this stuff, and I'm actually doing this from a client application. So it makes the web server call, but I'm actually calling it from JavaScript on the client. And there's all kinds of neat things in Visual Studio 2013 that even make this cooler. But for this, we'll just leave it like it is, and I'll go ahead now. And oh, you'll see here, let me open this up. This is what gets returned. So this is actually what's coming down from the client. What Internet Explorer does is it does it inside of a JSON array. And then Chrome, if we take the exact same thing and stick it inside of Chrome, you'll get a nice, nicely formatted display inside of the browser. Oh, come on now. So continue again, and you get a nice XML format. So there's just a difference in the way the default display is, and I believe you can change this for IE, but that's the default way that it displays. But anyway, you can see here I got customer ID 5 back, just like that. So if you're thinking, okay, how am I going to get data from a server, a real live sort of application using something like this is pretty straightforward and works pretty well. So now let's go back to our client piece. So that was the server. So let's go to my desktop, user group, Tech Ed India, part 1, part 2, hello world, client, customers, views, customers, edit this guy in Notepad, we'll run him in Chrome. And you can see when I click the button to view all the customers, it set, the breakpoint was hit in my web API. So we'll go ahead and hit continue. That doesn't like to do that in Chrome. Let's view this in IE. So here I hit my breakpoint, we'll hit continue, hit home, view customers. Where's my data? Oh, wrong one. All right, come on, IE. What are you doing to me here? There we go. Jenny Gibson, go back, etc. So the data is already down here. And I have the same interactions that I had with the all client piece, right? So I hit one breakpoint, all that data came down. And so once that data came down, it was all managed by Knockout. I never hit that second breakpoint because I was never actually using that other function call in my web API. At this point, I'm just working with the client data in my KO observable type. So anyway, that's a little bit more real world. It's probably the easiest way to actually work with server data using web API. And since I already kind of showed that one slide, I'll quickly show this concept. You guys have been working with spas forever, single page application, like Google Mail is a spa. Stuff like maps are spas, right? You're working with something on a page. It's never really refreshing. It's never going back to the server. The page loads up once, and you're just inserting data or removing data from that page through the lifetime of that page. And then it's up to you as a developer to manage how that data actually goes back to the server. Microsoft gives all kinds of ways to do it. You might argue too many ways to do it because it does get a little confusing versus how you may have done this before in ASP.NET. But there's other frameworks too. So earlier when we talked about frameworks like Backbone, Angular, Durandal, there's frameworks like Breeze that help data management. There's Hot Towel JS, which is a single page application template which combines Breeze and other application frameworks. It just makes your life a little bit easier to learn one of those frameworks and then sort of latch onto it, and that's kind of where you're going to go with your development. Don't try to learn all of them and use them and mix and match, because there's just too much going on. It's like having 5 different flavors of ASP.NET to use. And you can go online and see tons of guidance on these and then see the pros and cons of them as well. All right, we saw this page earlier, which helped us answer the question online. And this sort of is one of the longer, this is from a long article on MSDN, which Microsoft wrote about using these different technologies together in a single application. So we've done this demo. So the wrap up here in review, MVVM makes it easy to write declarative data bindings in your applications. You guys you think about this as MVVM just because that's the pattern historically used with WPF, historically used with Silverlight. Now it's moving forward into JavaScript with Knockout.js. Again, Knockout.js is open source. SPAs are a great way to deliver this app performance in a web page. You can go crazy with this and have like really crappy load performance, and then everything runs really well. So you have to manage like the minimal amount of data you need to load that page, and then you're working with getting stuff from a server, so you have some optimization there. And has anyone written store apps for Windows 8 or Windows Phone? And it's the same thing. I mean, you have to worry about how quickly this application loads up, how quickly I can get to that first screen, how quickly I can click on the glass to start interacting with the UI elements on that page. You don't want to be too long, or it just gets uninstalled and you get a bad rating. And it's the same way. You can't have unhappy users because you're trying to load too much stuff at once. Knockout and SPAs, great solution. Now then you go to this argument about, when are SPAs good, when are they bad. SPAs are a great solution for singular task apps, content consumption apps. You can go crazy with the SPA and do all kinds of stuff and be showing and hiding stuff forever. It can get really complex on the UI and the view. But I wouldn't build the next Outlook as a SPA, right? So Outlook is doing 20 things at once. It has a lot of stuff going on. Who knows? Outlook Web Access right now, I don't know if it's a SPA. It's doing a lot of AJAX. But you're really not getting a whole lot of page refreshes. But you want to be careful. You want to balance the complexity of your code versus how optimized it runs on the page and how fast the user can interact with it. A couple resources. This is an article that I wrote with another fellow at Infragistics. And this is called... No, this is not the article. The second one's the article. This is actually a really good article for everyone that's done ASP.NET. So if you're an ASP.NET developer and you are kind of confused and this is all new to you and you're wondering how the heck, or what does Microsoft really say? Like, what's their guidance about using a single page application with MVC, ASP.NET as my framework, using Knockout.js? That's a really good article. And the second one is a step-by-step article similar to the demonstration we just saw on Developer Tech Magazine. And there is, like I said, if you go to knockoutjs.com, it's a great, there's great information there on learning this framework. It's not difficult. It's not hard. You can learn it in a day and start playing with it. You can play with the code right inside their help pages. They make it really easy to use. So don't fear like necessarily moving into this Knockout world, because the resources are out there to do it. Pluralsight has great courses. John Papa has blogs and Pluralsight courses on this. So if you have a Pluralsight subscription, which many guys already do, you can watch his videos, and then the guidance just keeps going. And he actually, John wrote Hot Towel. Hot Towel uses Knockout and Breeze to have an application framework, essentially a single template that helps you build out these types of applications. So you can start with templates like that that kind of tie what he thinks is the right way to do stuff together. And that's it. So I want to thank everyone for attending. Is there any questions online? All right, cool. No questions in the audience? Oh, yeah, we have one question.
What's your view on AngularJS?
So Angular, I don't know a ton about Angular. I just know that the data binding model is different. And anyone in the room who's used Angular, feel free to offer any additional information. I believe Angular works on the concept of it tracks dirty records on a page versus tracking notification events or changes to actual properties on a page. But I don't think one's any worse or better than the other. I think Angular is probably a richer framework, has more features, but I'm not that familiar with Angular. There's a blog on Angular I can send you. It's off of our blogs, actually. One of our guys wrote it, and it talks about some of the differences as well. So I can send that to you. We can talk after. Yep.
Anyone else? Yep.
I've got some really conservative business clients. Is this production ready? Are real people using this for real heavy business applications?
Oh yeah, it's the real deal. It's got very widespread adoption, especially in the Microsoft space because it's from Microsoft. A guy who works at Microsoft wrote it. So when you hear Microsoft talking about Knockout, it's because, yeah, it's like something that they don't own, but they do support.
I said similar things I said similar things to my Silverlight clients a few years ago.
Yeah, I think the difference is when we think about jQuery jQuery and HTML5 being more like, HTML5 being an open standard, this being an MVVM pattern for more of an open standard. I don't see it as the same coming from like a proprietary nature like Silverlight, which Silverlight still is a great framework. It's just not very well supported anymore by Microsoft. I mean, it's technically supported, but you're not going to see a whole lot of improvements on it. And I think this is also different in the fact that where open source is interesting is that it is community driven. Now, it doesn't mean that there's like all these guys in the community working on it, right? Like, oh, we're just going to, thousands of people working on it. There's a core group of people that care about it and work on it. But then you can take it and make it your own and use it your own for, your business needs. So you're not necessarily dependent on the knockoutjs.com to satisfy your needs. You have the source code, you can modify Knockout, you can customize it for your own needs, and it's yours, with attribution, I guess. I don't know what the exact license is, but it's a little different than something like Silverlight, which you don't have the source code for, and you can't say to your customer, oh, don't worry, because I have the source, and when we need that next great widget or we need that next great feature, I'll just add it at my hourly rate.
Anyone else? Yeah, pass it around.
Dave's issue is for large-scale applications. So you've got thousands of different pages, big systems. I mean, I was looking at a JavaScript framework called ELM that does much more automatic binding, taking a lot of the dirty stuff away from you. Have you looked at that?
Nope.
I call some frameworks pretty dirty, all callback based, but ELM is not callback based. So
I'm not familiar with ELM, but that, again, there's 1,000 frameworks. I will say this about Knockout. Large-scale, enterprise-ready, what does that mean to you? So Knockout is not optimized for high-volume, high-performance data on a single page. Knockout is optimized to manage a manageable amount of bindings on a page. So imagine an array of 10,000 records with 15 or 25 columns or 30 columns that you might consider an enterprise app. Yeah, Knockout is not going to be super fast in that case because it's going to try to manage every item in that array and what's happening, and it's going to track it. The parsing itself will take a little bit of time. So you have to balance, where you need the performance. I wouldn't use Knockout to manage large arrays. I just wouldn't.
Yeah, but that's not the point. The point is that you have a large amount of code, not one. No, that wouldn't be a sensible UI to have thousands of things on a page.
No, you can't, trust me, I work at Infragistics. You have no idea what people do. That's why, Oh yeah, the question was, that doesn't make sense to have a UI like that. I agree with you. I've seen everything. And that's why, like, you know, our chart, we can bind 2 million data points in 3 milliseconds because we have to. You're like, why do I need that all at once? It's because, just because.
Yeah, you were doing something like that, you'd use data virtualization with WPF, like WPF can do, all your infragistics controls can do in that, so you wouldn't.
Well, no, but what I'm saying is, every time we say, why would you do that? The next question from a customer is, hey, can you guys do this? But I agree with you. I agree with you. And that's why your next enterprise framework, your next enterprise project, it's not as cut and dry. Like, I'm going to use Knockout for data binding. And then you run into a page or a set of pages that you see performance implications. And maybe that is where another framework can do better.
Efficient, productive, performance in terms of productivity.
Okay.
You're talking about, what I'm worried about is cutting and pasting of code. There's going to be a shitload of cutting and pasting of code. There's no general, it's like every page is the same sort of thing. Yep. There's no further abstraction. And so I build frameworks that are much more abstract. So you basically can automate, you have like a skin, and then it injects controls into the skin, and then the user can configure how he wants to actually see an update, that sort of thing. You're very hard, it's very low level, very hard coding.
No, and I've seen that as well. I've seen that in a lot of enterprises end up building those frameworks, because what happens is at the bank there's 4,000 developers. You can't have 4,000 guys learning Knockout, Angular, ELM. So then you actually, in your architecture group, design a framework that really abstracts out any complexity that they have to worry about, and that's what they use. So I agree with you 100%. When in an enterprise application or an enterprise framework that's used across a large organization that's actually structured, like has a center of excellence or something, you will find that more and more versus the Wild West, where anyone can do what they want. Yeah, and the other thing is, too, just a note on developer productivity, I think that's the biggest struggle right now. So, you're an ASP.NET developer, you're an ASP.NET developer, you're an ASP.NET developer. Great. My boss said, we got to do HTML5, and we're going to do client because we want to have responsive design. Guess what? Goodbye WYSIWYG. We're not using ASP.NET anymore. Your C# that was the primary language you use, now you have to use some other framework that you have to learn. It gets difficult. Like, the developer productivity on a small team and on smaller apps, maybe not even small apps, just could be a large app on a small team. Right now it's complicated because the tools are behind where the productivity level is today on older frameworks like Windows Forms, ASP.NET, WPF, Silverlight. Java, using Eclipse.
And you didn't mention SignalR, so are you recommending SignalR?
Yeah, we use SignalR for different things. Microsoft's using SignalR in Visual Studio 2013 for their web connection. SignalR is a very great, highly scalable framework. I wouldn't be surprised if GitHub uses it. Do you guys use it? No? Okay. And he's looking at me like we would never use that.
Long story.
Okay, long story. We'll talk about it later. But yeah, SignalR is a great new framework. Again, under certain circumstances, it's probably something that you would use.
Again, my problem is that they're not enterprise because they're not bus-based. So what I want is an architecture which gives me an automatic bus, and then UI components just hook into it, or server components hook into it.
Yeah, I think I'm getting the hook here. So let's talk about it over pizza later. Yeah.
We'll move on to the next one. So we're going to run out of time. Okay, so thanks very much.
Oh, my pleasure. Yep, thank you.
Did you get all that? We'll take the SSW TV quiz and test your knowledge now.